I'm here with Tom Mesereau, the famed defense attorney for Michael Jackson from his 2005 criminal trial, to talk about the Leaving Neverland movie on HBO. Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Always a pleasure.
It's always great to talk to you. And one of the things I want to talk about first is there's this notion that Dan Reed, the director of Leaving Neverland, has put out there, that there's this Jackson machine ready to destroy anyone who dares to question the narrative of this film. And I laugh at that because you and I have been in touch for quite a while, and I know that if there was a Jackson machine, you would have been paid to be on every television show possible as soon as this movie came out, but you were actually on trial yourself and unable to immediately respond. Is that an accurate?
Well, I wasn't on trial. I was in a trial.
You're in a trial. good clarification.
I was defending someone,
right?
Which is my profession. That's what I do. Look, Michael Jackson was at one point the most famous person on the planet. He was incomparable in terms of his talent, his influence on music, on dance, on choreography. He has millions of fans all over the world. He has a very lucrative estate that the lawyers for the estate have built up, and he has many supporters. But, you know, we live in the era of Me Too. We live in the era of media doing what media wants, and the idea that somebody is controlling the media about Michael Jackson is utterly ridiculous. I mean, when I walked into his defense in 2004, what I saw was so disturbing to me, and that was that the worldwide media had condemned him, they were attacking him, they had already convicted him, they tried to convict him during the trial with their coverage, they tried to convict him during jury deliberations when major networks were showing the jail cells they thought he was going to go to and that kind of thing. So anyone who tells me that the pro-Jackson forces control the world media when it comes to Michael Jackson it's laughable. It's ridiculous.
And it is. And part of that narrative, though, of course, what I'm trying to set straight is you're not being paid to do interviews on behalf of the Jackson estate. You're not held on retainer by them. You're doing this because you believe in the truth.
Yes, and I believe in the experience that I had with one of the accusers. I interviewed Wade Robson for hours before he testified. I interviewed his mother and daughter before they testified. I called all three as witnesses. They were among the most powerful witnesses in support of Michael Jackson. Mr. Robson was a very articulate, likable, intelligent, seemed like a nice person. He was adamant that Michael Jackson had never done anything improper towards him at any time. The mother and sister backed him up. They had traveled with Wade and Michael Jackson. They had slept in Michael Jackson's bed. They said nothing improper ever happened. And they were so strongly in favor of Michael Jackson and so strongly against the prosecution of Michael Jackson that I made them all star witnesses for the defense. So I interviewed them, I chatted with them at length, then I called them as witnesses, they testified under oath. I only know my portion of this, and that is that these people were adamant that nothing improper had ever happened.
Well, let's take a closer look at that, because to believe the narrative in Leaving Neverland, especially with regard to Wade Robson, you have to believe that you, Tom Mesereau, are a moron, essentially, because you took a guy who had been abused for 7 years by your client and made him and his family the centerpiece of your defense. Are you not personally offended by that?
Well, it was more than that. You know, I had to think long and hard about whether we needed to put on a defense case at all. You know, in American criminal courtrooms, the prosecution must prove their case beyond any reasonable doubt. And that means they must prove every element of a charged offense beyond any reasonable doubt. I had so many effective cross-examinations during the prosecution's case that I had to think long and hard about whether we needed to put on a defense. We could have rested right there and not called a single witness. But I concluded that we would probably have gotten a hung jury at that point, that we had to tell our own story. And we needed our own witnesses in support of Michael, and we had a lot of them that were very powerful witnesses. So I elected to put on a defense. When a defense lawyer in a criminal case elects to put on a defense, you typically want to start strong and end strong. And I started with a very strong witness, Wade Robson. I ended with also a very strong witness, Chris Tucker. And I wouldn't have called this person as my first witness if I hadn't felt he was really strong and would start off the defense case in a very compelling manner, and he did. He testified emphatically that he had not been abused, improperly touched in any way. He was subjected to a very strong, powerful cross-examination by Ron Zonin, an excellent prosecutor for the Santa Barbara County District Attorney's Office. He withstood that cross-examination. His mother and sister were in a similar position. I called them early in the defense case. They were powerful witnesses for Michael Jackson, powerful in their statements that nothing improper had happened as far as they knew, and they all were subjected to cross-examination. So I started our defense case very strong with one of the most powerful witnesses I had seen in favor of Michael Jackson, and that was Mr. Wade Robson.
And what you just said there is really important, because the whole essence of Wade Robson's current story in Leaving Neverland is that he's not claiming repressed memories suddenly hit him in his 30s, that he was abused by Michael Jackson. He's claiming that he didn't understand what had happened was quote-unquote sexual abuse. But that's not what he was asked at trial. He wasn't asked just, hey, did anything bad ever happen with you and Michael? He was asked very specific questions about physical acts which he very strongly declared did not happen, correct?
Absolutely. He was very, very powerful in his testimony that nothing, directly or indirectly, that's improper had ever happened to him. He wasn't improperly touched, he wasn't improperly fondled, he wasn't improperly molested. We went through all of this in direct examination, and he was subjected to a powerful cross-examination. And he was a stalwart witness in support of Michael Jackson's innocence. He was one of the strongest I heard. That's why I called him first.
And in making that decision, I'm assuming something here, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming you would consult your client, Michael Jackson, about his experiences with Wade and whether or not he thought it was a good idea to put Wade on the stand. Did that happen?
I mean, obviously, I don't want to go into privileged
Right.
information, but obviously Michael Jackson knew Wade was going to be my first witness. I obviously told him about that, and he had no problem with that at all. I mean, Wade was a strong, powerful supporter of Michael Jackson, and maintained that he had been to Neverland, he had associated with Michael, he had traveled with Michael, and nothing improper had ever happened at any time. He was so strong, I mean, I made him our first witness for a reason.
But just to further clarify that, the narrative in Leaving Neverland is Michael Jackson is a criminal mastermind. And I look at that and wait, well, hold on a second. If a criminal, you can't have him be a criminal mastermind and also have him allow you to put a guy he abused for 7 years on the stand first, right? I mean, those are contradictory narratives, are they not?
That would be a version of insanity, and that's not what I did.
Right.
I was there to win. I was there to win for an innocent person, and the jury saw it our way for many, many reasons.
Now, continuing with Wade's claim that what his testimony was about, I don't even know if you're aware, but in both of his lawsuit and in Leaving Neverland, Wade specifically claims he received a subpoena to testify in the 2005 trial, as if he did so against his own wishes, like he was forced to testify. Does that shock you to hear that allegation by Wade Robson?
It does shock me. Now, typically in a criminal case, if we need a witness, we will typically ask the witness, do you want a subpoena or not? Some people do because they have employment responsibilities. They want to be able to tell their employer, I have a subpoena, I have to testify. And very often they don't need a subpoena. And my understanding of Wade Robson was he didn't need a subpoena at all. He and his mother and sister all came to Neverland ready to voluntarily support Michael Jackson in and outside the courtroom. And that's what they did.
So, the best of your knowledge, then, Wade is not telling the truth when he claims to have gotten a subpoena to testify in 2005.
I don't recall whether anyone handed him a subpoena or not. What I do know is he didn't require one because he was willing to help Michael Jackson at all times. He was willing to be there when needed. That was always my understanding. Whether anyone actually filled out a subpoena and gave him one, or whether he even requested one, I really don't know.
Okay. And let's talk about the rest of his family, too, because his mother is a key figure in this story. She's the one that effectively facilitated the relationship between Wade and Michael Jackson. it is my belief that we have found some information about her on Facebook that discredits her current story, that she was still a fan of Michael Jackson well after Wade comes forward on the Today Show in 2013. What do you recall about her testimony and the testimony of her daughter as well, who you called in the 2000?
Well, I just recall that the mother and sister were very supportive of Wade and his testimony in favor of Michael Jackson. As I recall, and I haven't been through their testimony in years, but as I recall, they traveled with Michael and Wade. They were in the bed with Michael and Wade, sometimes sleeping in Michael's huge bed. This notion that he had a normal-sized bed is absurd. We prove that parents, siblings, all would sack out on Michael's bed. It was almost like a communal thing. But my understanding was that they were very supportive of him. They never detected anything improper, never suspected anything improper. That has always been my understanding of what they brought to the table in that trial.
Now, in the bigger picture, what I find really disturbing, and I'm fascinated to hear your view, is that HBO and Dan Reed have taken Wade Robson's story as if it's gospel and just effectively determined that his testimony in 2005, as strong and as specific as it was, is irrelevant. As a lawyer, not just the lawyer of this case, but a lawyer in general who reveres the law and the standards of testimony and under oath and perjury, I find that incredibly insulting and dangerous to the entire system, that once you make your declaration in the public under oath in a criminal trial of that magnitude, you can't go back and change your story.
Well, remember, one of the top sex crimes prosecutors in America, Ron Zonin, and I've never faced a better prosecutor than him. He was really just a passionate, skilled, experienced, determined prosecutor. He subjected Wade Robson to withering cross-examination, and this man knew how to question a sex crimes witness, and he could not shake Wade Robson. Wade Robson stood his ground, maintained his story under all sorts of pressure, and was also adamant, always adamant, that Michael Jackson never improperly touched him.
But isn't it, Tom, dangerous that the media and a major media outlet like HBO and this film, which is being seen worldwide, is just pretending as if adult testimony under oath doesn't matter? Like you can go back on that. That, to me, at what point do we reach chaos if that's going to be accepted?
Well, all I know is my slice of life. Right. All I know is the person that I spoke to, the person who I call as a witness, and there's no doubt in my mind he was telling the truth.
It just seems to me, though, that if we accept the notion that your past testimonies, I mean, as a defense lawyer, if someone before the current era we're living in, if you had someone who testified to something directly contradictory to what they're currently saying, that's game, set, match. That's the ball game, right?
Well, I mean, again, people will change their stories for various reasons, and they will come up with reasons to justify it. I mean, human beings have a great ability to justify to themselves whatever kind of behavior they want. But all I know is I spoke to him for hours. He testified on the stand. It was the most watched trial of my lifetime. You had more accredited media from around the world than O.J. Simpson and Scott Peterson combined. And he was in the spotlight in that courtroom and subjected to withering, persistent, skilled, professional, experienced cross-examination. And he was adamant that Michael Jackson had not improperly treated him.
And he was an adult who was very well versed in what sex was, had been in numerous high-profile romantic relationships. This was not a naive guy.
No, this was someone, in my opinion, very intelligent, very articulate, very perceptive, seemed very likable, and didn't look to me like he was making anything up.
Now let's turn to James Safechuck. I know you didn't interview James Safechuck because James Safechuck had been determined by the judge to not be eligible to testify in the 2005 trial. Yet in Leaving Neverland, he tells a very detailed story that is critical to the narrative, that both Michael Jackson and Michael Jackson's attorneys were contacting him into the late stages of the trial, effectively begging him to testify, which he refused to do. That, to me, sounds completely contradictory to what we know as the factual record. How does that sound in comparison to your recollection of the events of 2005?
It makes no sense because the prosecution wanted to bring in witnesses to suggest that Mr. Safechuck was molested. The judge would not let them do that. At that point, the defense had no necessity to bring in Mr. Safechuck. In fact, it would have been insane. If we had called Mr. Safechuck, that would have opened the door for the prosecution to call witnesses they claimed would have testified that he had been molested. So this story doesn't make any sense to me. Now, I know I didn't contact him. Did someone behind my back contact him in a way that made no sense? I can't speak for that. But I know it makes no sense to think the defense was planning to call Mr. Safechuck. It would have been insane.
And it is a fact that Mr. Safechuck had been declared by the judge well before the trial began as off limits, correct?
Well, off limits for the prosecution.
Right.
Now, if the defense had brought him in as a witness, that would have opened the door for the prosecution in a rebuttal case to call in their witnesses about whether or not Mr. Safechuck had been molested. But it makes no sense for the defense to keep Mr. Safechuck available to call as a witness at that point.
And what about the story of Michael Jackson calling James Safechuck in the middle of the trial, intimidating him and desperately demanding that he testify? Does that sound like the client that you knew?
No, the Michael Jackson I know doesn't intimidate anybody and would not have contacted him and tried to scare him or threaten him. That doesn't make any sense to me.
So you believe that's untrue, based upon your knowledge?
I don't believe Mr. Safechuck was contacted by the defense throughout the trial. I don't believe that because it was very clear before the trial started that any allegations about Mr. Safechuck were off limits.
Now, one of the things that has actually gotten some fair media coverage and has contradicted the narrative of Leaving Neverland is that over the last several weeks, it has been revealed that a prime location where James Safechuck now claims, many years later, that he was molested by Michael Jackson was the famous Neverland train station, the second floor of the train station. And he claims that in the movie and in his lawsuit that his abuse ended in 1992. And we now know that the construction of the train house didn't even begin until late 1993 and didn't finish until somewhere in the middle of 1994. The director, Dan Reed, has claimed that doesn't mean anything because he's just going to extend the date beyond which James Safechuck was actually abused, which then would make him 16 or 17 years old. I have a couple questions about this, but what's your first gut-level reaction to that shift in story as a defense attorney?
Well, I don't believe these accusers. I just don't. I got to know Michael Jackson very closely during that terrible ordeal that he went through in Santa Maria in that courthouse. I got to know him. I sat with him through a 5-month trial. I saw him reacting to some of the most horrific allegations you could have. I mean, people forget just how awful these allegations were. He was being accused of masterminding a criminal conspiracy to commit extortion, to abduct children, to falsely imprison a family. He was being accused of giving a cancer-stricken child alcohol to prepare the child to be molested. I mean, these were horrible allegations. I sat with him throughout that trial. I worked with him before the trial. I saw him after it. There's no doubt in my mind he was not a child molester. He was not a child abuser and would never hurt a child, period. So when I hear these allegations suddenly popping up years after his death, they make no sense to me. I don't believe them. And my experiences with particularly Mr. Robson suggest to me there's something radically wrong with these accusations.
But, all right, so let's take the train station thing a little bit more specifically. If this were to go to a traditional trial, what would you, Tom Mesereau, as a very experienced and esteemed defense attorney, what would you do with that kind of a shift in story that doesn't just change something that's minor? You know, Oprah Winfrey tried to pretend that this was a minor mismemory. This totally changes the timeline. It changes when he was abused, how old he was. Supposedly Michael Jackson stopped being interested in these boys when they hit puberty, but now James Safechuck is a very old, mature, and tall 16, 17-year-old. What would you do if you were cross-examining James Safechuck in a situation like that?
Well, it would be a defense lawyer's dream. I don't know if you remember during the Michael Jackson criminal trial, one of the accusers said that he had been shown a particular magazine as a grooming process. And we proved that the magazine had been published long after this person left Neverland. Evidence like that can be devastating. If Mr. Safechuck said he was molested in that train station and the station hadn't even been built, that could be devastating evidence for a jury in judging credibility.
Now, I know you're not involved in any of these cases directly, but what do you make of what the estate is doing in trying to come to a way to adjudicate these claims? Obviously, with Michael Jackson dead, there's no such thing as defamation against a dead person. What is your evaluation of what the options are and how the estate is proceeding legally to try to clear Michael Jackson's name here?
Well, I'm not involved in any of the civil suits by Mr. Robson or Mr. Safechuck. I have not participated in any of the court hearings. I've not reviewed any of the documents. I wasn't present for any depositions. I don't know what people have said or not said in the course of the lawsuit, so I can't really speak directly on that issue. My perception at a distance is that the estate is being very, very aggressive and very effective in trying to protect the name and the likeness and the image and the reputation of Michael Jackson. I'm actually very impressed with the aggressive approach they've taken, and I hope they continue it, because these accusations are scurrilous. I've not seen the film, Leaving Neverland. My understanding is they don't ever talk to anyone on the other side. They basically accept Mr. Robson and Mr. Safechuck's accusations. And remember, we're talking years after accusations like this were made. We're talking about people who would have had plenty of time to look at the details very closely of what accusations other people have made. And if you're going to either intentionally or unintentionally pattern yourself after prior allegations, there would be plenty of time and plenty of information available for one to study, if that's what you're doing. I don't know whether these people really believe what they're saying or not. I mean, the longer I walk through life, the more I realize human beings have a way of convincing themselves that what they're saying is true, even if it looks ridiculous. So they may actually believe what they're saying is true. I don't know, but I certainly don't.
You mentioned that Leaving Neverland doesn't give any of the other side, which is 100% accurate. The most glaring witness in this whole thing that they omit totally from even being mentioned is Brandy Jackson, the niece of Michael Jackson, who dated Wade Robson for 8 years, including 2 years during which Wade now claims he was abused by Michael Jackson. Brandy is sure that Wade is not telling the truth, and she knew him exceedingly well. If in a prosecution case, Wade Robson had testified without ever mentioning Brandy Jackson, and you as a defense attorney was able to show the jury, hey, you never got told about a Brandy Jackson, here she is, and here's her story. How do you think that would impact a jury's view of a story like this?
Well, I don't know what he allegedly told Mrs. Jackson. I'm really not knowledgeable about that relationship. I believe what she's saying. I believe he never raised the issue because it never happened. But I'm not a witness to any of this. I just know I looked this person in the eye, and I chatted with him extensively, and his mother and sister were sitting right there too. And I believe he told the truth in the trial. I believe he told the truth to me. And the new stories, the new versions make no sense to me whatsoever.
Talk to me about the media. I know that you have been very critical of the way the media has treated Michael Jackson in general, and specifically how they responded to the 2005 verdict, which they clearly did not like. I was part of that media that was, as a talk show host in Los Angeles, I was surprised by the verdict, but I thought it was legally correct because I did not believe that the prosecution had proven their case. At that point, I was still naive about the facts, all of this, and I thought, well, there must be something there for them to go this far. Now, I've totally changed my mind after getting to know you and researching this after Leaving Neverland. But what is your evaluation of the media just deciding to blindly accept ridiculous allegations that are contradicted by voluminous evidence simply because it fits a narrative that they like?
Well, the media is a business. They're in the business of generating revenue and getting ratings. And that's their number one priority. Their number one priority is not justice or fairness. It's shock value, it's controversy, it's colorful experience. The media wants what business requires. And you can't keep that out of your mind, because if you think they're out for fairness or justice, you're naive. I remember after the Jackson acquittals, I had lunch with Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, and his family. And he said to me, "Do you realize you cost the worldwide media billions of dollars when you acquitted him?" Because he said the final chapter had to be a conviction, where they hauled him off to jail, where they brought him back for hearings dressed in an orange jumpsuit and chains, without makeup, without his normal apparel, leading up to perhaps one of the biggest sentencings in American history. This is what the media wanted, and they were denied that when the jury said not guilty 14 times. So I will forever be scarred by that experience. I remember, when we walked into the courtroom, sat at counsel table, I looked around and I saw all these reporters with big smiles on their faces and a big gleam in their eye. They were so excited by what was going to happen that day. And after the last not guilty, I hugged Michael Jackson and looked, and I could see the disappointment in their faces. The story was over. The final chapter could not be written the way they wanted it to be, and business had suffered because of that. They had to abandon Santa Maria. They had to walk on to some other subject, and it was very disappointing to them. Justice is not their goal. Ratings and revenue are what they want.
Amen to that. Okay, so one more big picture question here. That happened in 2005. We're now in 2019. In between, the cultural rules, largely because of the news media, have dramatically shifted, mostly because of the so-called Me Too movement. I'm curious, in general and then also in specific with regard to Michael Jackson's case, how impactful has the rules being changed because of Me Too been on how these kinds of cases are evaluated in general? And specifically, do you think you could have gotten an acquittal in 2019 under the same circumstances with Michael Jackson today that you did in 2005?
Well, if you're talking about Michael Jackson, you have to remember how vicious the media was in 2005. I mean, the media worldwide were at best mocking Michael Jackson, at worst calling him one of the world's greatest villains. And the media had already convicted him. The media had already tried him and found him guilty. And the media onslaught to see him go to prison was so effort. I mean, it was, I don't know how to explain it. It never ended. It was 24-hour cycle. Do I think it would have been harder to acquit him now? I actually don't, because the media pressure then was so bad. I don't think it could have been worse. During the week of jury deliberations, major networks were showing the jail cell he was going to go to. They were talking about what food he would eat, what schedule he would keep, whether he would be on suicide watch. All of it was designed to influence the jury to get a conviction. So in Michael Jackson's case, I don't think it could have been worse. But in terms of other people accused, it's a very, very troubling environment, because Me Too has a lot of good elements to it. I think to flesh out sexual harassment, or worse, sexual assault, the way it's being done, to some extent is very appropriate. The problem is that emotion is now substituting for due process. And if you're accused, before you have the ability to even speak up on your behalf, and before the rules even kick in to give you a fair hearing, you are condemned, you are fired, you are vilified. There's something wrong with that. We've had other movements in American history where emotion and passion replaced due process, replaced fairness. And I'm talking about the Salem witch trials. I'm talking about the anti-communist movement. I'm talking about rounding up Japanese on the eve of World War II. America in its history has had phases where passionate movements take off and due process, fundamental fairness, the Constitution takes second fiddle. And we have to be very careful right now, because some of that's going on.
Tom Mesereau, criminal defense attorney for Michael Jackson in the 2005 criminal trial. Thanks so much for your time. We'll continue this conversation on our podcast, which you can find on April 27, 2019 for more of this, and find it at www.freespeechbroadcasting.com. Thanks so much, Tom.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.